But without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker to you. And our first speaker, it will be a name known to many of you, David Robertson. David, come on up. David founded Solas 6 years ago and is also known, of course, as a pastor and a blogger and as someone who's involved with the media on a near daily basis. And just before I hand over to David, we need to notice this wonderful new fashion accessory David is sporting here today. If he were to tell you the full story of what happened, it would take up his full allotted time. Suffice to say, it involved cycling into a grave in a graveyard while trying to avoid a council van and then a run-in with a bacon roll. I believe there's a book and a movie coming with Brad Pitt signed on to play David. But without further ado, David, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And unfortunately, the story that he's told you is actually true. In fact, it's so true that the consultant who treated me in Nine Wells Hospital couldn't do it because she was laughing so much. So anyway, with a cracked clavicle, we shall continue. I do want to say what a privilege it is to be here. And this is something that I regard as hugely, hugely significant in lots of ways. And also how we get the balance of this. I'm so pleased that Ed's able to be here. I think this is a really, really key issue, and there will be, my text number will come up at the end if people have got questions and so on. I've been thinking about this for years, and it is just so important to the cause of the gospel and for what's going on in our culture. Now, I wanted to just put some caveats right at the very, very beginning. What I'm going to do, a lot of it is going to be broad, sweet, big picture stuff. So there probably will be lots of questions and ideas and different things. And we do have some resources that are mentioned for that. I also want to make it very, very clear that this is not a political rally in which we are arguing against a particular group of people. I am a biblical Christian, and so I believe that all human beings are made in the image of God, and that all of us are fallen and broken, and we'll see more of that as we go on. But I thought I would begin with the new Nobel Prize winner, Mr. Robert Dylan, who did speak of the times changing and so on. And, you know, unless we get with it, we will sink like a stone. And it's changing phenomenally quickly. And in fact, it is coming in like a flood. Even today, coming down on the train, I was reading The Spectator, as one does, and there's an article by Rod Liddell, How Pete Burns Helped to Create Our Fatuous Modern World, in which it looks at several of the issues that we are looking at today. And then I heard on a news item, Miley Cyrus coming out as pansexual. Now there's a whole range, a whole new vocabulary that a lot of people just won't have a clue about. And then I heard about the 14-year-old girl whose parents do not accept that she's a boy, and yet social services are thinking of taking her away from her parents, who happen to be Christian, because they don't accept that she wants to self-identify as a boy. And so it's an issue that's constantly ongoing, and it's not going to stop. People say, right, it'll stop here, it'll stop here. No, we're heading on a slope that, in my view, is leading to absolute chaos. So I want to kind of go through that. I'm going to do the broad picture, big picture stuff. But as we do that, please remember, we're dealing with individual stories. This is not theory, this is about people. BBC Scotland had a program this week. There's a program every week about individuals who were transgender. It was one of the saddest things that I have ever seen, and so depressing. This is about individual stories. Jane, who thinks that she's a boy trapped in a girl's body. John, who's bullied at school because he's gay and he now wants to marry his male friend. Susan, who finds that she's attracted to people of the same sex, but for some reason feels guilty about it. Everyone's story is different. But here's the problem. When people want to use propaganda, they give you individual stories of which you have limited knowledge to get your sympathy and say, well, therefore, you've got to go for the big picture. I want to give you the big picture, and then we'll talk about individual stories throughout the day. Now, Let's see if this thing works. This is Dermot McCulloch. And this is basically, I'm going to give you a very simplistic version of it, but the 21st century, what the 21st century liberal humanism tells us. Now, Dermot McCulloch had a 3-part series on BBC Two entitled Sex and the Church, in which he stated, I think religion has got everything appallingly wrong, and it's been terrible for us in sexual terms. Now, to summarize his position, this is the, forgive the very simplistic analysis, this is what he says. Before Christianity came on the scene, sex was a pleasure in the Greco-Roman pagan world. Everyone just did it and just got on. It was just like eating food, and you could pick whatever you want. But then along came Christianity, and especially St. Paul, and then Augustine, and lo and behold, sexual repression entered into Western society. And it has taken many hundreds of years, but finally now, after the Enlightenment, we are returning to those wonderful golden days of sexual freedom. Now, this is all post-1960s, but this is what's supposed to be happening. The only thing that's stopping us in Scotland today are those religious people, especially the Catholics and the Calvinists. Are there still any Calvinists left? Yes, there's 1 or 2 of us still around. We're an endangered species, but we are still here. But the Catholics and the Calvinists especially, it's their fault. And we are to be blamed for everyone's sexual problems. In our brave new world, people should be free to sleep with whoever they want, whenever they want, because sex is just like an appetite, such as eating. And what's wrong with having a smorgasbord of love? As long as we don't harm anyone, what's the problem? And how dare you judge? Isn't it interesting, by the way, how often people will judge you for being judgmental? It does seem a slight contradiction. But there's another big picture, and I want to suggest to you it's a much more realistic picture, one which for the moment we are allowed to teach, and one on which our whole society has been based. A picture which we are currently in the process of rejecting without knowing what will happen. And I would suggest that we can predict what will happen. Maybe we are heading into a secular sexual nirvana. Or maybe we're just heading into the pit of hell, because that's the way that I would regard it. So I want to give the Christian bigger picture in a little bit more detail. Psalm 8. Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory in the heavens. Through the praise of children and infants, you have established a stronghold against your enemies, to silence the foe and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them? Or the old version had, what is man? But of course we have to redo our language. But I do like the phrase, what is man? And that also was an essay by Martin Luther King. Fascinating essay from, I think, 1959, in which he argues that humanity has to be more than just flesh, and that there is a spiritual side. Now, when we're talking about this in terms of big picture, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking of what G.K. Chesterton said, that if we lose God, we also lose humanity. And in one sense, I want to argue that Christians are the ultimate humanists, because we do believe in humanity, because we believe that human beings are made in the image of God. And without the divine, we are essentially missing the heart of what it is to be human. Now, you'll forgive my Presbyterianism in quoting. I'm going back the way. Let me go forward the way. Let me quote the Shorter Catechism. How did God create man? God created man, male and female, after his own image, in knowledge, righteousness, and holiness, with dominion over the creatures. It's a great summary definition of what it is to be human. We are more than just chemicals floating from one meaningless existence to another, as Bertrand Russell says. And at its most basic level, this involves gender. We are created male and female. Our identity is found in God. Marriage, we're created for one another. And society, we serve God and one another by following the Maker's instructions. Now, long time ago, because then there is the fall. And again, as a Christian doctrine, this is fundamental to our understanding of humanity. And what the fall does, it disrupts our most basic relationships. It affects the environment, it affects society, it affects our relationship with one another, because it affects our relationship with God. The basic difference between humanity before the fall and humanity after is that before the fall, we live to do the will of God. After the fall, we are autonomous and seek to be as God. We, in the words of Fleetwood Mac, go our own way. Or sadly, still, the number one song played at crematorium in Scotland today is Frank Sinatra's I Did It My Way. That's an appalling statement for anyone to have on their deathbed. I did it my way. But autonomy is the religion of our culture. It's how you have euthanasia and everything else. So, I've got to be able to control and to have things. We are, as the devil said, you shall be as God, determining your own right and wrong. Sin is rebellion against God, and it's an assertion of our own sovereignty and authority. Now, I want to consider how the fall works out in these major areas. First of all, in terms of sexuality. There was a Smirnoff advert in 2015 which was meant to be quite funny. Heterosexual, homosexual, who gives a sexuality? Who cares what your sexuality is? Now, what I think surprises most people is that the notion of sexuality as a form of identity is a relatively new one. Basically, late 19th century, but especially Freud, emphasized sexuality as defining who you are. And by the way, that creates one of the biggest problems when we're trying to discuss things, because I don't define myself by my sexuality. I think the notion of sexuality as an identity issue is a really important one to try and grasp and understand. Now, for decades, we were told that people are born this way. You're born homosexual, you're born heterosexual, that's the way it is. And in churches, constantly people have been said, well, God made me this way, so it must be right. Well, I think it's slightly unfair to blame God for everything that's wrong with me. There are certain genetic components, I'm sure, to my personality, which are less than good. And I'm not going to turn around and say, well, God made me that way, so it's okay to be bad-tempered and angry. But actually, in terms of what is termed sexuality, it's now generally recognized that the notion of being born this way is facetious. There's a shallowness in understanding, but the notion of a fixed sexuality is now being challenged by those who once argued that it was the very basis for accepting gay rights. Rather than God made me this way, we're now coming to a position where people get to choose their own sexuality. In fact, I was in the Village in New York, and I met some radical gay activists who were furious at the idea of a gay gene or anything like that. They said, this is what we choose. And my most interesting interaction with this has been with Peter Tatchell, which is fascinating. Peter Tatchell is an Australian. He's the primary gay rights activist in the UK. He's a man in some ways I admire. He lives consistently according to his own beliefs. I think he has some great ideals. And I've met with him and debated with him. And I remember at the end of it saying to him, Peter, in one sense, you're going to get everything that you want because no government's going to refuse you what you want. Not in the West. But you're going to lose everything that you're aiming for because you won't get it your way. But one of the fascinating things in discussing with him was on this issue of sexuality. And he doesn't believe in fixed sexuality. He believes in fluid sexuality. And that is the position now that we've changed within a decade. And that's why today in Britain, under 30s, you will get twice as many people self-identify as bisexual rather than homosexual. So I think of my oldest daughter's class in Morgan Academy, where she told me that 6 of her classmates said they were bisexual. Only 1 would have said homosexual. Now, what's going on there? Why is that happening? The Daily Telegraph, of all things, ran an article a couple of months ago in which it said there wasn't a single woman in Britain who was totally heterosexual. Well, what's happening? It's because the meaning of the words are being changed. Incidentally, I was speaking at a school this week, and I asked the young people there what percentage of people in society they thought were homosexual. Do you know what they said? The lowest was 10%, the highest was 30%. The actual figure, according to the Scottish Government research, most recent, is about 1% and less for women, higher for bisexual. But the bottom line is that the most recent research suggests this, that the understanding of sexual orientation as an innate, biologically fixed property of human beings, the idea that people are born that way, is not supported by scientific evidence. However, there is evidence that biological factors such as genes and hormones are associated with sexual behaviors and attractions. There is no compelling causal biological explanation for human sexual orientation. Longitudinal studies of adolescents suggest that sexual orientation may be quite fluid over the life course for some people, with studies varying, but one at least estimated that up to 80% of those who experience same-sex attraction as teenagers no longer do so as adults. Peter Tatchell, I put this quote up because I think this is phenomenally important. I lifted this. Peter has now been arguing this for 2 years openly. Last week, again, he came out and he argued for it. His view is that the term homosexual will become redundant, as will the term heterosexual. And I'll read the whole quote over the next 3 slides. Overcoming homophobia will result in more people having gay sex, but fewer people claiming gay identity. The medieval Catholic Church, despite all its obscurantism and intolerance, got one thing right. Homosexuality is not, it suggested, the special sin of a unique class of people, but a temptation to which any mortal might succumb. It now seems fairly certain, in the light of modern research, that some people are born with a sexual desire that is to varying degrees capable of both heterosexual and homosexual attraction. Once homophobia declines, we are bound to witness the emergence of a homosexuality that is quite different from the homosexuality we know today. With the strictures on queerness removed and same-sex relationships normalized and accepted, more people will have gay sex, but paradoxically, less of them will identify as gay. This is because, in the absence of homophobia, the need to assert gayness becomes redundant. Gay identity is the product of anti-gay repression. When homosexuality is disparaged and victimized, gay people, understandably, feel they have to affirm their desires and lifestyle. However, if prejudice is vanquished, and if one sexuality is not privileged over another, defining oneself as gay or straight will cease to be necessary and have no social significance. The need to maintain sexual differences and boundaries disappears with the demise of straight supremacism. Homosexuality as a separate, exclusive, clearly demarcated orientation and identity will then begin to fade, as will its mirror opposite, heterosexuality. Instead, the vast majority of people will be open to the possibility of both opposite sex and same-sex relations. They won't feel the need to label themselves or others as gay or straight because in a non-homophobic culture, no one will give a damn about who loves and lusts after who. Now that is a hugely important statement, and we need to realize where this is going. Tatchell is winning the argument. Most people now, apart from in churches who want to affirm gay identity as an identity, most people now accept that sexuality is something that is fluid. What harm does all this do? That's the question I asked at the beginning. Now, I'm just going to mention 1 or 2 things. Compared to heterosexuals, non-heterosexuals are about 2 to 3 times as likely to have experienced childhood sexual abuse. There is numerous research that indicates that active homosexuals have a significantly shorter lifespan. And those who engage in homosexual activity lose 25 to 40% of their lifespan. Factors including various sexually transmitted diseases, infectious hepatitis, anal cancer, amoebic and other infectious bowel diseases, herpes and other viral infections, HIV, AIDS, amongst others. There is also significant evidence from the United States, I haven't seen it from this country, but from the United States and Canada, that domestic abuse is higher in same-sex relationships. Members of the non-heterosexual population are estimated to have around 1.5 times higher risk of experiencing anxiety disorders and double the risk of depression and 2.5 times the risk of suicide. Now, that is normally explained as being, well, that's because they're oppressed and so on. But as our society is becoming less and less that way, I think that that correlation isn't correct. So I think there's a great deal of harm involved, and we need to ask questions about why. Second thing I want to look at very briefly is in terms of marriage. For decades, people like Peter Tatchell sought to destroy marriage. So I found myself in this rather strange position of him arguing for marriage in a debate I did with him. And I said to him, "You've changed your position." And he said, "Yes." Because 10 years ago, he wrote an article in The Observer saying that those who argued for same-sex marriage and who were gay rights activists were traitors. That same-sex marriage was a ridiculous idea. And I said to him, "You've changed your mind." He said, "Yes, I have." And I said, "No, you haven't. I don't think you've changed your mind at all. You've changed your tactic." I said, "You still believe that marriage is a patriarchal institution which oppresses women and other people?" And he smiled and said, "Yes." I said, "You know that the way to destroy marriage is to redefine it for everybody." And I think that's what's happening. After debating Tatchell, I wrote a letter to David Cameron, our late lamented Prime Minister, and got a response back saying, the government believes that you should be able to marry whoever you love, which is one of the most inane arguments I've ever heard in my life. And when you think about it and what it involves, it really is quite difficult. I've met many politicians who, when they voted for the redefinition of marriage, had no idea what they were doing. They thought they were making a statement on behalf of an oppressed people. They didn't think about the consequences. They didn't see that the redefinition of marriage is just part of a wider philosophy which seeks to redefine humanity and create a world in which we choose our own sexuality and our own gender. For them, it doesn't matter that in the beginning God created us male and female. What matters now is that human beings can recreate humanity in our own image, and we will end up with the nonsense of transhumanism. Let's say something about gender. Gender as identity makes a whole lot more sense. I mean, after all, what's more basic? I've been at the birth of all three of my children, and the cry, "It's a boy" or "It's a girl," I personally didn't like to know beforehand. So, I mean, that's wonderful. It's just a very, very simple and basic thing. Most of us have been brought up in a world where we're born male and female. We no more get to choose our identity in terms of gender than we do in terms of skin color or height. But that's now all changing. First of all, we've been taught that gender is much more than biological, and it's really dependent on how we feel. Secondly, gender dysphoria, which was a psychological disorder in which I, as a male, for example, might think I was female. In fact, I went down to the London Science Museum, and I did a wee test down there when we were there on what kind of brain do you have, and I said to my wife, "You're not going to believe this, I've got a female brain." And she said, "I knew that." I said, "Oh, thanks, great." Or I remember one time there was a lesbian couple I was talking with, and they knew my views, my biblical views on homosexuality and so on. We got on really, really well. And I said to them something I shouldn't have said. It was it was a bit daft. I said, I don't think you're really lesbians at all." And they said, "What?" I said, "I think you just hate men." I said, "You just like each other and you live together." And I said, "I bet you the sex is not that important." And actually, they said to me, "Actually, that's true, David." They said, we're not bothered about the sex, and we do hate men." And I said, "But we get on, you like me." And they just looked at me and went, "You're not a real man." I went, "Okay." So I've had to deal, I've got issues. But you need to understand this. New York City now has a state law that there are 31 genders, and if you refuse to accept someone by one of those 31 genders, you can be prosecuted and fined up to $250,000. Facebook tells me there are 56 genders. Somebody wrote me in a furious rage saying, "David, there are as many genders as there are people." Now that's insanity. But that really is where we're going. They're getting rid of gender altogether. Now, there's lots of consequences of that. For example, it kills women's sports. I mean, I wrote once, I get in trouble for writing stuff on my blog, and I wrote once that all Andy needed to do in terms of winning Wimbledon was, if he thought he wasn't going to win it again, just change his name to Andrina, and he would win the women's Wimbledon, and he'd get as much money, because it's gender equality. And people were in uproar and wrote all kinds of nasty things. And then I saw a photograph of the Iranian women's football team, 8 of whom are men, awaiting gender reassignment, because in Iran, believe it or not, it's the country where most gender reassignment issues are done. I'm not sure why. I think it's maybe because they hate women. I'm not sure why. But that's, I mean, it's just bizarre. It's totally, totally crazy when you look at it. That's where we get all this, the whole kind of transgender stuff. We have a parliamentary committee that's ordering doctors to move away from seeing transgender as a problem of the mind or an illness, and insisting that we replace the present medicalized process with a simple self-declaration, which will mean that you can walk into a post office and say, I'm now a woman. Now, there's all kinds of different, or a man. There's all kinds of problems with this. Also, let's say I'm an SNP politician and Nicola says we're going to have 50-50, male, female. And so I go up for application to apply as an MSP and say, no, the quota for men is filled. I just go to the post office and fill out a form and say, well, now I'm a woman. Or what about in Polmont Prison this week? There's a young man, 18 years old, who's been accused of rape. He's announced himself as a woman. His name has changed from Alex to Alexis. And he's insisting on being in the women's prison, which on remand in Polmont means he gets to walk around all the different cells. He's charged with rape. And according to the law, that's going to be accepted unless the Solicitor General intervenes, which they probably will. But that's the kind of insanity that we're getting. You can self-declare to be whatever you want to be and to fit whatever you want to fit. The whole idea of multigender and so on. I want to go on to show this video if we possibly can. This came out, I think this week actually, and already it's had 7 million views.
The single most common question I get asked is, are you a boy or are you a girl? The simple answer is no. But then the response after that is usually a very confused, what? So here is the explanation. I am non-binary, and that means I identify as something other than male or female. Our society and history has led us to believe over thousands of years that there are only people who are male and people who are female. But that is because past society has based gender on physical sex.
Let me see what it is, nurse. Ah, yes, what a strapping young lad.
It's outdated. The truth is that gender is in the brain, and physical sex is a completely separate and different thing that is private to every individual. What people really mean when they're asking the boy or girl question is creepily, so, what genitals do you have? People need to realize it doesn't matter what living meat skeleton you've been born in, it's what you feel that defines you. Non-binary is a blanket term for anyone who identifies out with the binary gender. There are endless ways of being non-binary, and no two people identify in the same way. So just remember, gender is what you feel, not what your parts are. Don't be afraid to be yourself. Bye, guys.
Now, what does that matter? I'll tell you what it matters. Because I have a 7-year-old girl in my congregation who came home last week and said to her mum and dad, Mum, the teacher told me today I get to choose if I'm a boy or a girl. Our children are being indoctrinated, and this is only the beginning. The harm that this does to people. I'll tell you about a teacher who phoned me up and said, what do I do? We've got a 14-year-old girl in our school who suffers really badly from depression, has all kinds of problems, we really want to help her, but because of all this fuss about transgender, she's now identified as a boy, and the head teacher is proclaiming it all over the place because the school has to tick boxes for the government saying that they're transgender friendly. Or the woman who phoned me up, who is bitterly opposed to what I say, thinks I'm, crazy and all the rest of it. And she phoned me up to ask for help because her teenage son had gone to school, suffers from depression, and a teacher had said to him, well, maybe you suffer from depression because you're a girl trapped in a boy's body. And I said to the woman concerned, I said, don't you realize that's just what you've been asking for? She said, but I know that he's not. She said, I'm nothing against transgender, but I know that he's not. But you see, we have moved from transgender. We're not even at transgender anymore. We're at no gender. The New York Times had an article last week boasting about how Scotland had become a society, and one of the government advisors here was saying, we have moved to a genderless society. Schools that are being built around Edinburgh right now have to have gender-neutral toilets, or you won't get the contract to build them. I mean, we need to grasp and understand what is going on. Now, I'm going to mention just some of the costs involved in this. I want to give you one quote, though, from the American College of Pediatricians. Conditioning children into a lifetime of chemical and surgical impersonation of the opposite sex that say that is normal and healthy is child abuse. Endorsing gender discordance as normal via public education and legal policies will confuse children and parents, lead more children to present to gender clinics where they will be given puberty-blocking drugs. This, in turn, virtually ensures they will choose a lifetime of carcinogenic and otherwise toxic cross-sex hormones, and likely consider unnecessary surgical mutilation of their healthy body parts as young adults. In other words, I'll put this very simply, when the Scottish government says they are going to enforce and promote a radical culture which says that children can choose their own gender, they are engaging in organized, systematic, state-enforced child abuse. And when you have, at a major political conference, a woman standing up and saying, I'm 80% male and 20% female, and get a standing ovation, you're thinking, have we moved? What kind of world is that we are living in? Now again, please do not misunderstand this. The first transgender person I was ever involved with was 25 years ago in my congregation in Brora. And you don't, for me, all human beings are made in the image of God. It's not despising a group of people, but I'm telling you this, you do not help people by creating and enforcing this kind of confusion. Let's go on to the next one, please. Now, how the impact that this will have in society, again, is in so many different ways. I think that democracy will be done away with. I think we will have religious thought police. I think it's astounding that Scottish police, who are considerably under-resourced, are now training 90 policemen and women to be LGBTI liaison officers to deal with hate crime against LGBTI. Now, hate crime against LGBTI is, obviously, we're totally opposed to it. But this is gesture politics. Why are there not trained police officers having to deal with other kinds of hate crime? There's the cost in terms of the legal system. There is a 7-year-old boy whose mum says that he's a girl. The 7-year-old says that he's a boy. But there's a conflict between the two parents because there's been a divorce. And the mother is obsessed with transgender. And she says, no, I want to bring him up as a girl. And the social workers went along with this and said, yes, you dress him as a girl and so on, that's your choice. And a judge came out with this ruling. I consider that M has caused significant emotional harm to J in her active determination that he should be a girl. I find that she has overborne his will and deprived him of his fundamental right to exercise his autonomy in its most basic way. Whether J chooses to present as a girl or not ought to be his choice. This is not a case about gender dysphoria, rather it is about a mother who's developed a belief structure which she has imposed upon her child. Now get this, that judge, for making those remarks, has undergone a hate campaign and is being accused of being transphobic. We've had the Ashers case. We've had many, many other things. I mean, the flood of all this is just coming in. This narrative is being taught in our media and our soap operas. The Dundee Book Prize 2 weeks ago was won by an American author who wrote a story about coming out as a teen transgender. It is the absolute in thing. And it's creating phenomenal difficulties, especially in our education system. Can we go on to the next one, please? Now, there's a poster that is going around a school that someone from my congregation works in. And you can see on it, it's quite extraordinary. This is what's being taught to 6- and 7-year-olds. You have mum and dad and mum and mum's girlfriend and dad. I've seen a video that's been commended by Stonewall for nursery school kids talking about people having 2 mums and 2 dads, or 4 mums and 3 dads. The whole notion of family and parents and everything is being completely and utterly destroyed. Now, there are a whole range of other factors involved here that I don't have time to go into, but I will warn you of this. Time for inclusive education, if that gets passed, then all I would say for me as a Christian parent, I'm done. I can't send my kids to be indoctrinated in this kind of stuff. There is a cost. There's a phenomenal cost in terms of economics. Do you know that it costs £40,000 to £50,000 per year for each child refugee taken into care? And I hope that we take many of them. I really do. These children are refugees from war and poverty. And it's correct that a wealthy nation like ours should take that and deal with it. But there are hundreds of thousands of children who are refugees and victims from the war on marriage, the attack on humanity, all because of humanity's pride and arrogance in seeking to go against the Maker's instructions. In my city, there are 1,500 children in care. And when I talked to somebody responsible for that and said, that's ridiculous, in a population this size, 1,500 in care, they looked at me and they said, David, there should be 3,000. We think there are 3,000 in danger. You know, this is all fine when you do it in a debating theory in sort of middle-class universities and societies and so on. But where it's not fine is when you go into our housing schemes and you see the mess in the kids' lives. And when you see the sexual abuse and everything else. And I'm not talking about homosexuality, I'm talking about across the whole culture, how that works. There are 50,000 people in Britain who are registered pedophiles. The police reckon it's 250,000. Where's this all going to go? Well, if we take humanity away, humanity made in the image of God, then we'll continue to go down this road to hell. C.S. Lewis saw this years ago in the third part of his sci-fi trilogy, That Hideous Strength. I think he described prophetically with eerie precision where we are going. We're going to end up with transhuman. What if you want to improve yourself? What if you want to be beyond being human? We're going to end up with transabled. What does that mean? It's people who say, I don't like having two legs. I feel like I'm a one-legged person. Please remove my leg. Well, if what you feel is to, and you say, don't be daft. There's examples of this already. We end up with polyamory and polygamy. The SNP candidate who eventually became our MP at a hustings in St. Peter's in Dundee, when asked about polygamy, said, I don't see why not. Of course, when the Daily Mail got hold of it and went to SNP headquarters, they just lied and said he never said it. Well, we have it on record, he said it. And why not? He's quite right, he's been consistent. Why shouldn't you be able to marry as many people as you want? What about incest? I spoke at a debate in Aberdeen. The older people there included a gay couple who gave me a lift to the station, and I really got on very well with them. In fact, they said to me that I'd convinced them to be against gay marriage, which was a very interesting conversation that we had in the car. But they were astounded, as I was, that virtually all the younger people under 30, when I said, what's wrong with a brother marrying a brother, or a sister marrying a sister, or a mother marrying her daughter, they looked and they said, why not? Because by the criteria given in our culture, yes. What about pedophilia? Now this is different, and it's the big one. Please be careful. Do not start saying things like homosexuality leads to pedophilia. That's nonsense. What I'm saying leads to pedophilia is when we reject the image of God in humanity. Now, in the 1970s, and I don't have time to go into this, for some reason, pedophilia was the big sin. But now, pedophilia is currently being redefined as a sexual orientation. So if you have a government policy that says we do not discriminate according to sexual orientation, there's an immediate problem. Peter Tatchell, again, when I did a debate on gay adoption, some of his supporters came to it. And this was 20 years ago. And I've never forgotten this, because my children at that time were 6 and 8 years old. And my opponent, who was arguing for gay adoption, who was himself gay, at one point he came on my side and we stood together, because some of Tatchell's supporters said, I said to them, do you seriously want to see the age of consent lowered to 14? They said, we don't want an age of consent at all. And they told me this to my face. Remember, my children were 6 and 8. If we were babysitting your children, we would teach them to experiment sexually, because we don't want them to be sexually repressed. Now, when I wrote to the Herald and wrote about, not about that, I wrote about Tatchell's wanting the age limit lowered to 14, the Herald refused to publish my letter on the grounds it was homophobic. Listen, this whole thing, you can't stop pedophilia if you tell people that their sexual urges are absolute and they must obey them. There's a guy gone to jail in Perth because he's written a letter to all his MSPs saying that he is a pedophile and he's going to abuse children because that's the way he's been made. Now, I wish people could see that. So, let me summarize this and finish with a kind of more positive thing. Well, in concerning society, I think we're giving up rationality, truth, and logic. We were made in knowledge, righteousness, and holiness, and I think when we reject the source, we end up losing the fruits. So if you are what you feel and how you self-identify, what if I self-identify as a 5-foot Chinese woman? Who are you to stop me? I think family, church, and society will be replaced by individuality, corporations, and disintegration. And I think love, peace, and goodness will be replaced by hatred, strife, and immorality. Now I say that's the big picture. How we react, I'm going to talk about that in the second session that I'm involved in, which will be much shorter. And also, if you've got any questions, please do text them, and I might try and answer them as that as well. But we'll do that in the second session. But I want to go back to this idea of the big picture and the small picture, just kind of to finish. We do need to listen to individuals. I wrote a piece on transgender, and a transgender professor wrote me and said, "I'm really angry with you, David," and so on. And I said, "Okay, nothing new, but let's not do this by email or internet. Let's meet up." So we met up and we had coffee together, and we had a great time. And she basically said to me, "You're not as evil as they say you are," which I thought was interesting. You know, so coffee does everything. But here's why. I don't see her as transgender. I see her as a human being, made in the image of God and messed up. And she said to me, "Do you think I'm messed up?" And I said, "Yes, but I'm probably more messed up than you." Because that's what we are, if you get the big picture. So you're going to have to deal with all different kinds of people, and I strongly recommend Rosaria Butterfield's story. I think there are small stories. I think there are middle stories, like the cultural trends of what I've been speaking. But we don't counter that by Christendom or British values or getting all political and all upset and campaigning and marching down the street saying down with that sort of thing. This is what we do. We counter it with the gospel. I began with Bob Dylan. Let me come to a conclusion with Augustine, but also Leonard Cohen. He's got a great new album. If no leaves were on the tree and no water in the sea, and the break of day had nothing to reveal, that's how broken I would be, what my life would seem to me if I didn't have your love. We counter all this, not with hatred, not with homophobia, not with transphobia, not with fear. We counter it with the love of God and the gospel, the good news of Christ. There's so much brokenness, and so much of that brokenness is expressed in dysfunction. And there's an ugly sexual dysfunction, and there's an ugliness in there. Can the ugliness be redeemed? Can it be made beautiful? Yes, there is an ultimate makeover. And I do want you to have these two quotes from Augustine that I read in his homily on 1 John. "Let us love," says Augustine, "because he first loved us. For how should we love except he had first loved us? By loving we became friends, but he loved us as enemies, that we might be made friends. He first loved us and gave us the gift of loving him. We did not yet love him. By loving we are beautiful. But our soul, my brothers, is unlovely because of iniquity. By loving God it becomes lovely. What a love it must be that makes the lover beautiful. But God is always lovely, never unlovely, never changeable. He who is always lovely first loved us. And what were we when he loved us but foul and unlovely? But he did not leave us foul, no, but he changed us. And out of the unlovely makes us lovely. How shall we become lovely? By loving him who was always lovely. As the love increases in you, so the loveliness increases. For love is itself the beauty of the soul. How do we find Jesus beautiful? You will never convict, convert, or change anybody by telling them how ugly they are. You will never bring anyone to a living faith in Jesus Christ until you show them who Jesus is. And the beauty of Christ overwhelms absolutely everything. I have sat with a woman who was raped constantly as a child by her father and other relatives. And she's one of the most beautiful people you will ever meet in your life, because the love of Christ transformed, changed, healed, and redeemed her. And that's what we offer to people. Now, there's a caveat that I want to use Augustine again, because there are Christians who go, yes, that's right, I agree totally with that, so don't deal with any of this stuff. Just be nice to people, and then they'll come to Jesus. No, they won't. Listen to what Augustine said. Behold, hatred shows itself winningly gentle, and charity quarrels. Charity for Augustine means love. Love quarrels. Stay not thy regard upon the words of seeming kindness or the seeming cruelty of the rebuke. Look into the vein they come from. Seek the root whence they proceed. One is gentle and bland that he may deceive. The other quarrels that he may correct. Well then, it is not for us, brethren, to enlarge your heart. Obtain from God the gift to love one another. Now you see what he's saying? To just say, oh, I'm not going to challenge this. I'm not going to stand up to this. I'm not going to disagree with anybody. I'm just going to be nice. That can actually be a form of hatred. You know, the American media's Peller and 10, when there's a famous clip where they said, I don't mind when people come up to us and try and warn us about going to hell, and Jesus said, if you really believe that, how much must you hate someone not to tell them? Well, think about it. We are going to have to, in this culture, stand against the tide and be overwhelmed with accusations of hatred and abuse and everything else, and we're going to be called everything under the sun, but we do so not because we hate people, but because we love people. And we see the bigger picture. And we present them with Christ. We must never hate them. So that's why Augustine goes on. Love all men, even your enemies, not because they are your brothers, but that they may be your brothers, that you may at all times be on fire with brotherly love, whether towards him that is becoming your brother or towards your enemy, so that by being beloved he may become your brother. I'll confess something. I find it quite hard when I get abuse, and I get hate mail every day. And I find it quite hard not to hit back, because I'm human and I'm not a super saint. But I pray that God would give me the grace to love people who hate me. And that's not easy. But that is what we have to do, because that's what Jesus did for us. And in this whole issue, the whole big picture is this. I just say it again and again and again, because it gets so misunderstood, and we need to work out what it means. And I'm trying to work it out after 40 years of being a Christian. How do we love? How do we love other people? And how do we love with the love that Christ has given us? So, the news is we're in a mess, and it's getting worse. And please don't hide away from that. But the bigger picture is God knows, and God's always known, and he's placed us here with his message of redeeming love through Christ that we can offer to every single person. We can go to every single person and say, there's good news for you. There's good news for you. And it's not that you can be whoever you want to be. It's that you can be who God intended you to be. May God bless his word. Amen.
People in Scotland, and I would also say people in the United Kingdom and probably in most of Europe, are more open to the gospel now than I've ever known. But the church is less prepared to communicate it.
We live in such a post-Christian culture that we're encountering people now who have no conception of what the gospel is. They're not resistant to it, they just don't know what it is. And our challenge as Christians is, how do we convey the gospel into the public square, into the halls of power, into the marketplace, into education and media in such a way that engages people?
People do not know about Jesus Christ. They have no idea, and asking people to believe in Jesus when they haven't a clue who he is. Who's Jesus? You know, tell me about Jesus. They have no concept of Christianity. We're basically bringing up people who are fundamentally ignorant of the gospel and who are being brought up within the framework of a secular thought that completely excludes any concept of the supernatural.
We want to take the gospel into the public square and show how as Christians we don't need to retreat from places like Edinburgh and the centres of power. Rather, we can go in and the gospel will stand up as it's always stood up. We want to engage in evangelism that influences in a place like Edinburgh. At the same time, we also want to be equipping Christians and the church to do the same. As you explore our website, I wanted to encourage you to check out a number of different resources we have there. We have the magazine, we have podcasts, we have videos, all kinds of rich resources that you can use in your personal evangelism, and also we encourage you to use them to teach and train and equip others in your churches and your communities to do the same. Make use of them, download them, share them with your friends, and we also encourage you to pray for us, stand alongside us, and look to partner with us. We love to come alongside churches and organisations and individuals to help you take the gospel into your neighbourhood, and we look forward to partnering with you in seeing God's kingdom extend here in Scotland and across the UK.